Okay, so the basic controversy is, do tables and chairs really exist? I know this sounds crazy to outsiders. So the real mystery, and this is where I'll start in tonight, is how can this possibly be a controversy? Why is the apparently obvious evidence not taken as decisive, evidence in favor of the existence of tables and chairs? And how could even the cleverest of philosophers possibly give any kind of remotely convincing argument against the existence of things like tables and chairs? Now, as I was just mentioning, this is a relatively new controversy in the history of philosophy. Previously, it arose, if at all, in the context of global debates between realists and anti-realists, or realists and idealists. But even then, the point wasn't usually put as saying, look, tables and chairs don't really exist, right? Berkeley, for example, wanted to insist that he's not denying the existence of the common sense world. All he's doing is offering a different view about what it's made of. That it's really that tables and chairs and the like are just collections of ideas, not material objects. He thought the idea of material objects was sort of ill-formed, didn't make a lot of sense. So, and yet it's become a really hot debate, especially really in the last 20 years in metaphysics. And not just about tables and chairs, but also debates about whether or not organisms exist, whether persons exist, whether or not anything other than simples exist, whether or not even simple particles exist. So you have these increasing metaphysical debates, right, that have really proliferated in the last few decades about what exists. And you get people defending all sorts of diverse opinions. Some of you were in the class this afternoon, we talked about this. Then you get people defending the view that there are only simples. You get people defending the view that whenever you've got two things together, there is a new thing. So there is, for example, what they call the mereological sum of this marker and my car, which is back in Miami, right, as a new thing. You get people defending the view that there are organisms but not artifacts. All sorts of metaphysical views about existence have really proliferated in the last few decades and taken center stage in metaphysics. Why? What's going on? What is it about the contemporary approach to metaphysics that's different from metaphysics as it was done maybe 100 years ago or further back, that invites and sustains this kind of controversy, say about the existence of ordinary objects or about organisms or whatever? And finally, I'll suggest that there is something different about the contemporary approach to metaphysics and to this whole branch of philosophy than had gone on in philosophical history before that. And so these debates about the existence of tables and chairs and so on lead us naturally in debates about what we're doing in metaphysics. What is it that we're doing in metaphysics now that we weren't doing before? What is it? What kinds of methodological presuppositions do we have now that we didn't have before that makes this kind of debate sustainable and makes it seem at least of interest to the participants? So what I hope that you will get out of this talk, I'm not going to do so much in the way of trying to resolve the controversy of the existence of tables and chairs. What I want to do is try to make it clear how there could be such a controversy and what this controversy shows about what's going on in metaphysics and in this corner of philosophy today. So what I'll do is to try to walk you through first why the apparently obvious evidence in favor of the tables and chairs and the like isn't taken as decisive, what arguments are given against them. I won't tell you about the replies to these arguments just because that would take too long. But I'll lay out the arguments. Make notes for yourselves. Is there anything you want to know more about? How have people replied? How have people defended tables and chairs against these kinds of arguments? That's a great thing to talk about in the discussion, and I can give you an idea of where some avenues of response lie. And then I'll talk about why these debates about tables and chairs lead into debates about the very nature of metaphysics and what they reveal about the methods of metaphysics. Okay, so here we go. So the obvious evidence, apparently in favor of the existence of tables and chairs, right, is just perceptual evidence. You seem to see them, you can hear them if you rap on them. You may be sitting on one right now, right, like that fellow. So why isn't that taken as decisive, sufficient evidence to show that there are chairs? Here I am. What better evidence could there be? I'm sitting right on one. I can feel it. You can taste it. Not recommended. Right? It's supporting your weight. Why doesn't that prove that there are chairs? Well, the reason it's not taken as decisive by disputants in this debate is that there's another candidate in the vicinity for what it is that we're seeing, that we're feeling, that's supporting our weight as we sit down. And that is, as most people would say these days, the basic physical entities. Say, at least the atoms, maybe something more basic than that whatever the fundamental entities turn out to be, arranged in a certain way. So particles tightly bonded in a certain way, and so on. The way in which this raises the question of the existence of ordinary objects was probably brought up, as far as I know, in the sort of earliest form, and certainly memorable form, by the physicist Sir Arthur Eddington, who sort of famously talked, and I'm sure some of you know this passage, of his two tables. Right? So he writes, "I've settled down to the task of writing these lectures and have drawn up my chairs to my two tables." Two tables. Yes, there are duplicates of every object about me. Two tables, two chairs, two pens. What are these two tables? Well, the first is the common sense table. The common sense table, Eddington says, has extension. It takes up space. It is comparatively permanent. It is colored. Above all, it is substantial, whatever exactly that means. But there's also the scientific table. The scientific table, Eddington writes, is mostly emptiness. Sparsely scattered in that emptiness are numerous electric charges rushing about with great speed. But their combined bulk amounts to less than a billionth of the bulk of the table itself. There's nothing substantial about my second table. It is nearly all empty space. So we have these sort of two candidates for the table out there, right? There's the common sense table that's colored, that's solid, and so on. Then there's the scientific table, which we think of as being just these sort of widely scattered, essentially, compared to their own bulk, particles in empty space that aren't substantial, that aren't solid, that aren't colored, right? It doesn't make sense to speak of these particles presumably as colored, and so on. So the two tables of Eddington differ in color, solidity, and substantiality on his reading of the situation, but they, in some sense, do the same work, right? So Eddington writes, notwithstanding its strange construction, the scientific table turns out to be an entirely efficient table. It supports my writing paper as satisfactorily as table number one, common sense one. If I lean upon this table, I shall not go through, and so on. So they both do sort of the same work. Now, since these two tables both do the same work, right, either would be a perfectly good explanation, the idea goes, of your experience, of why you're having a certain perceptual experience right now, of why you're not falling through to the floor right now, and so on. In fact, you might even think that if you can get the full story in physical terms, in terms of the fundamental particles and their bonding relations and so on, you'll have a much better explanation of your perceptual experience, of the fact that you're not falling through to the floor, and so on, than you can get using just the common sense table and the relevant terms. So that's the sort of first answer to the question of why the perceptual evidence isn't taken as decisive evidence in favor of the existence of ordinary objects. But the fact that the common sense table and the scientific table do the same work is also taken as a sort of first stage argument against the existence of ordinary objects. Why is that? Well, it seems like any causal powers that you might have wanted to attribute to the common sense object, to the ordinary object, what can it do? Anything you might have wanted to say can be just as well or perhaps better attributed to the underlying scientific things. Now, the scientific table may be a sort of poor way of speaking. It's not clear that these particles and so on count as a table at all exactly. Certainly some philosophers would want to deny that they're any one unified thing at all, rather than lots and lots of things that are buzzing around in certain related ways. But at any rate, the form of the argument is much the same. So Peter van Inwagen, contemporary philosopher at Notre Dame, writes, all the activities apparently carried out by shelves and stars and other artifacts and natural bodies can be understood as disguised cooperative activities of simples properly arranged. He's going to want to talk about simples arranged in a certain way rather than the scientific table, right? But that's just what he's getting at. And so we end up with this first line of argument directly against tables, not just undermining the arguments for them, but an argument against them, what gets known as causal redundancy arguments. It goes like this. Look, the scientific entities here, right, whatever they are, can account for all of the causal work that we would normally attribute to a table or a desk or a podium, right? But, well, so, sorry, I think I have the second stage next. And so we have no need to posit a common sense table, as is often said, over and above the scientific stuff there in order to account for our experience. Moreover, we may even have reason to deny it. For a lot of philosophers accept what's called the Eleatic principle that says we should only accept the existence of entities which have causal powers, or sometimes it's put as having distinct causal powers. So if the table isn't going to have any distinct causal powers over the particles arranged in certain ways, then we shouldn't accept its existence. It's a simpler theory without it. So you get appeals to parsimony that say we ought to accept the simpler theory. The simpler theory just appeals to particles, not tables. And it's also a theory that doesn't posit causally redundant entities. So, I mean, this is a principle that seems to make some sense, right? If you're a scientist, why should you posit, say, a neutron as well as protons and electrons? Presumably, there's some reason, there's some bit of evidence, of experimental evidence, that positing a neutron can account for that protons and electrons alone could not account for, right? And that's why it's worthwhile positing them. If you could do everything with just your protons and electrons, hey, no reason to posit the neutrons. Similar form of argument being used here, right? Saying, look, if you can account for everything that's going on, all your supposed evidence, what you're seeing and feeling and all that, in terms of the fundamental particles, ditch the tables. You get an argument like this made in even stronger form by the philosopher Trenton Merrickx, the contemporary philosopher at UVA, in what he calls the overdetermination argument. What he does is to allege to actually find an inconsistency, a contradiction within our normal concept of, well, he does baseballs instead of tables, on account of this causal redundancy problem. So let me just read you what he says first, then we'll talk about it. He says, look, if there were baseballs, they would break windows. They would injure batters. They would cause visual sensations and so be seen. And they would cause tactile sensations and so be felt. So it's part of the very concept of a baseball, on Merrick's view, that it has certain kinds of causal powers. Okay, that's reasonable, right? But given the overdetermination argument, if there were such objects, they would not have causal powers because anything you want to attribute to them is better accounted for by the fundamental particles arranged in a certain way. So unless you want to say there were two complete causes for the shattering of a window, say, that it was hit by millions of particles in a certain arrangement and that it was hit by a baseball, which would be a completely redundant explanation and implausible to think that there's all this extra causation in the world, then we better deny that the baseball has any causal powers at all because the scientific entities, the particles, have better credentials. And so we'd have to say baseballs have no causal powers. Oh, but it's part of the very idea of baseballs that they have causal powers. Contradiction in the very idea, no baseballs. That's Merrick's version of the argument. Now, there's a natural reply to this line of argument, right, which is to say, hang on there. What you're trying to do is to introduce a sort of causal rivalry between the baseball and the fundamental particles that we would naturally want to say make it up, that compose it, right? But isn't the baseball just identical to the properly arranged and bonded particles? And if so, there can't be any real rivalry to them, between them for causation, any more than there can be a rivalry for whether it was Clark Kent or Superman who saved the person, or whether it's the morning star or Venus that's affecting your eyes in the morning. Right? If they're the same, there's no causal rivalry, and we don't have to eliminate one of them. In fact, the idea of eliminating one and not the other makes no sense if they're identical. Right? Okay, natural line of response. But there are all sorts of barriers to saying that the ordinary object, the baseball or table, is identical to the fundamental particles. Well, the first barrier, a fairly obvious one, as it's often said, a one can't be identical to a many. This just doesn't make conceptual sense. So one table or baseball can't be identical to many particles. Okay, so you might say, look, just say that the one table is identical to the collection of particles, and that's a singular term, right? And then we don't have this problem. Now, some of these philosophers, like Van Inwagen, want to deny that there's such a singular thing as a collection there, too. We'll put that to the side for a moment. Let's work with that idea. You've still got problems for trying to identify the table with the collection of particles arranged in this way. Why? Well, they have different as is often said, modal properties. That is, they'd survive under different conditions. For example, if by the collection of particles you mean this very collection of particles, you lose one, it's a different collection, right? It's a different set. There's one less in it. But you lose, so that collection is destroyed. But you lose one particle, you still got the same table, right? There you go. It's still there. So they have different survival conditions. They may also have different histories, right? The collection of particles presumably has existed for a long, long time. They were just scattered around the universe. Then they were brought together somehow through history, whereas the table might have only come into existence yesterday when they were assembled in this particular way. And so, but one and the same thing can't have both been created 1,000 years ago and yesterday. One and the same thing can't both survive the removal of some particles and not survive the removal, so they can't be identical. These are the sort of standard arguments against identification. And the way it's usually glossed is saying they may have different modal and historical properties. But if the table can't be identified with the collection of particles, then to say that there is this collection of particles and there's also a table seems, again, entirely redundant, at least to a lot of people. The collection of particles, after all, is doing all the causal work, it seems like, and has the better credentials, the better scientific credentials. We've got better sort of scientific evidence of it. It can be used in more robust explanations than the table of all the experience we have, and so forth. So, for example, to sum up this line of thought, we have a quote from John Heil, who's not endorsing this line of thought, but he's reporting on it in a quite clear and useful way. The swarm of particles has impressive credentials. It's recognized in physics. Our best science tells us that the swarm exists, behaves in particular ways, and falls under strict laws of nature. The table standing is less impressive. He, like me, is sort of reviewing these arguments against ordinary objects. He ultimately will defend their existence, as do I, by the way, just so you know where I stand. So I'm giving the arguments against, but I'm on the other side at the end of the day. And Trent and Merrick's, again, there's this picture now, puts the point this way, that if you tried to accept, again, assuming their non-identity for the reasons I was just discussing, accepting both the table and the objects of physics would, quote, imply, as far as physical explanations are concerned, a needless multiplication of physical objects. If you try to accept the existence of both the collection of particles and the table, you also hit some other first-rate philosophical, metaphysical problems. One of these is known as the problem of collocation, right? That is, if the table's right here, the collection of particles are right here, and I want to say that both exist, oh, then am I saying that there are two distinct objects that are composed of all the same parts, at least if you cut them up, right, the same particles or whatever, and that are in the same place at the same time? But doesn't that violate, again, a lot of the arguers will want to suggest, doesn't that violate the perfectly plausible principle that no two physical objects can be in the same place at the same time? And so it looks like you're committed to this kind of problematic collocation if you accept the existence of tables as well as of particles. This leads back into a deeper problem that's known as the grounding problem. It goes like this. Given all the chair and the collection of particles have in common, they're made of all the same parts, right? They're in the same place at the same time, they have the same causal powers. How could they possibly belong to different kinds, so that one's a collection of particles, the other belongs to the kind chair? How could they possibly differ in their histories? How could they possibly differ in the conditions that they would and wouldn't survive, their modal properties, and so on? What is it the objection usually put? What could possibly ground this difference between them if they're intrinsically just the same and they're in the same place at the same time, made of the same stuff? How could they have these differences? So here's a way of putting that problem by Erik Olson. His quote was too long to give him a picture. It says, by definition, materially coinciding objects are made up entirely of exactly similar particles, related in precisely the same way in identical surroundings. They are, after all, the very same particles. That would seem to make the objects so similar that even God couldn't tell them apart. How then could they have the qualitative differences that constitutionalists, that's someone who believes that there is a table, there is a collection of particles, and the particles constitute the table, though the two aren't identical, say they have? By virtue of what, for instance, could they belong to different kinds? What could give them different identity conditions? Another problem, just around the corner, if you accept the existence of tables as well as of the collection of particles that apparently compose them. Vagueness. This is a classic argument against the existence of ordinary objects that, again, kind of like Merrick's take on the causal redundancy argument, what he called the overdetermination argument, attempts to find a contradiction within our very ordinary concept of table or chair, or do it for whatever your favorite is. It goes like this. Look, here's part of our basic concept of table, that a table is something made of many but a finite number of particles. Lots of particles, but not an infinite number. And here's part of our concept of table. You take a single particle away from a table, and it doesn't turn it into a non-table. Removing one particle can't make the difference between what is and isn't a table. But taken together, these lead to an inconsistency, right? Because you can repeat 2 an endless number of times, removing particles, until you're down to, say, only one particle. By 2, none of these processes of removal could have made the difference. Could have turned a table into a non-table. So at each stage, you still get a table. So then you're down to, say, one particle. By 2, you still got a table. That contradicts 1, that a table's got to be made of many particles. Right? You can even move that last one if you want to do with none. Same difference. OK, so this is an argument that Peter Unger has raised that alleges to find an inconsistency in the very concept of a table. And of course, if the very idea of a table is inconsistent, it's usually thought there can't be anything answering to it. So there can be no tables. Oops. There's problems closely related to the vagueness problem, too, that come up. One is the problem of the many. So it's often thought that if there are tables and other ordinary objects, that they have to themselves be vague objects, whatever else that would mean. Why? Well, suppose that we identified the table with a very precise collection of particles. Right? If I say there's a table there, then there are actually a great many very slightly differing collections of particles, differing only in, say, one particle each as to what is and isn't part of it, right? Depending on exactly where you draw the border of the table. But if you count such a fully precise object as a table, then where we thought there was just one table, there's actually many, many, many tables, because there's many distinct, overlapping, only slightly varying collections of particles in roughly that place, right? Oh, but we didn't want to say there were 10 million tables there. We want to say there was one table there, right? So for that reason, it's often thought that if you do accept ordinary objects, you've got to say that they are not fully precise. They're not, even what composes them isn't a precise collection of particles, but they are things that themselves have fuzzy boundaries. And yet a lot of people have thought that the very idea that there are vague objects in the world, that there's vagueness out there, no, it just doesn't make sense, that the world is fully precise, and that all that can be vague is our concepts or our language, our ways of carving up the world, but the world itself is precise. So what could these vague objects possibly be? Another challenge for the defender of ordinary objects. Another line of argument that's been raised, this is a really recent one. I think this really just came fully into the discussion in the 1990s. In fact, I believe it was Professor Hestefold who first raised this question. Is that? Yes, is that right? Yes, so from right here, and then popularized by Peter van Inwagen, this so-called special composition question. The pressure of it is this. When is it that, suppose you got some simples, right? Under what conditions do these simpler objects add up to or compose some new object, some further bigger object, right? What does it take? Gluing them together, they're being in contact, they're being fused, what is it? You've got a lot of, so there's pressure to give a sort of uniform answer to the question of when do we get composition occurring. And the sort of common answers that are given, some of them are nihilism, like never. Simples never add up to or compose some further object. All there are is simples. Universalism, which says always take any two things, again, like I was saying, this marker in my car, right? They compose some further new object. There's mereological sum of the pen in my car. Van Inwagen himself defends this sort of moderate answer, moderate in the sense that it's between those extremes, what he calls organicism, that simples only compose some further object if they are organized in such a way that their activities involve a life. That is, if they form some organism, some plant or animal, and so on. But none of the sort of standard and obvious answers to the special composition question give us a kind of common sense view of what exists, right? Nihilism obviously rules out persons, artifacts, organisms. Organicism rules out artifacts. Universalism gives us a whole lot of stuff, but it gives us a lot of stuff that's not commonsensical, like the mereological sum of this pen and my car, right? So none of these are a sort of answer that's going to give us a kind of common sense ontology. And that has been thought by many to put pressure on the idea that that the common sense ontology is right. Okay, so I've run through, again, without showing you the responses. There have been lots of responses to all these, and I'm sure lots of you are thinking of responses to lots of these arguments as we go through them. There have been plenty of responses in the literature, but what I want to do is at least lay out where the arguments have lain, and we can talk about responses later. I've given responses to a bunch of these myself. But here's where we've gone, right? Summary of problems raised for accepting the existence of tables and chairs, causal redundancy, violation of parsimony, right? Now you're accepting more things than you need to account for all your evidence and experience. Collocation, how can there be two things in the same place at the same time? The grounding problem, how could they have different modal and historical properties given that they've got all the same parts and are in the same place at the same time? Inconsistency in the very idea, that's these sort of Sorites arguments that try to show that based on that you can remove one particle and still have a table, but then that ends up conflicting with the idea that a table's got to have many particles, and the pressure of answering the special composition question. The way this is put as an objection, of course, is that no decent answer to it is going to give you a common sense ontology. All right, so putting that aside for the moment, having done a little survey of the arguments against, let's turn to our historical question. Why has this controversy arisen now, and why did it not so much before? Well, a tempting answer as to why the controversy arose now is, well, because of the advance of physics, right? I've been talking in terms of particles arranged in certain ways, and you might say, okay, the particulate theory of matter is relatively recent at least, and maybe it took philosophy a while to catch on to the problems that it raises. But I don't think that's right. I don't think that's why this controversy has come up now. Why not? Well, all that you really need in order to raise all the problems I just listed, you don't need any knowledge of particle physics. All you need to know is that ordinary objects are divisible. They've got smaller parts. And then you've got the problems that, for example, the whole is co-located with these parts. You've got the problems that you can remove little parts gradually and there's no clear stage at which it turns into a non-table, and so on. You can go through all the prior arguments. So all you really need to raise the problems is knowledge that ordinary objects are divisible, but this is just real common sense knowledge, right? No doubt known to the ancients. You learn about that just by sanding a table down, right? Or building one, or rubbing real hard to remove a stain, or whatever. It doesn't require any specialized scientific knowledge, just a kind of ordinary experience that's been around for probably as long as tables. So why then? Well, I think the key factor, this may be a simplification, but I think the key factor isn't the advance of physics, but the advance of Quine. Here I talk about the American philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine, who famously argued that ontological questions are on a par with questions of natural science. In fact, he held that the questions of metaphysics are really part of a total question of total theory construction that metaphysicians and scientists and so on alike are engaged in together. So here's a longer quote from Quine. Quine wrote, "Our acceptance of an ontology is, I think, similar in principle to our acceptance of a scientific theory, say a system of physics. We adopt, at least insofar as we are reasonable, the simplest conceptual scheme into which the disordered fragments of raw experience can be fitted and arranged. Our ontology is determined once we have fixed upon the overall conceptual scheme, which is to accommodate science in the broadest sense." So we have this model, what you might call a sort of scientistic view of metaphysics or of ontology, right? Whereby metaphysics is to proceed on principles similar to those of science. We're trying to get a best sort of total theory. Our theory is subject to, we're trying to develop it in a way that will maximize the theoretic virtues like explanatory power, parsimony, and so on. oh, here we go. Right, so what we've really got, and of course it's not just Quine, though he's really the one who popularized this kind of understanding of metaphysics, is this sort of scientistic assumption that treats metaphysics as engaged in a kind of explanatory theory construction that follows the same sorts of principles as those that govern the natural sciences, or maybe even better put, as engaged in one and the same enterprise of constructing the best total theory. So here's a sort of statement of it by contemporary philosopher Ted Sider, who's sort of summarizing what he takes as, the term that's used is mainstream metaphysics today. What's going on in mainstream metaphysics today? Again, it's not everybody for sure, but it's certainly a sort of dominant conception, especially behind these kinds of debates about ontology that I've been discussing. Sider writes, competing positions in mainstream metaphysics are treated as tentative hypotheses about the world and are assessed by a loose battery of criteria for theory choice, the same kinds of criteria that are employed for theory choice in the sciences. Matched with ordinary usage and beliefs, and common sense, you might say, sometimes plays a role in this assessment, but typically not a dominant one. Now you can see this kind of scientistic assumption is lying behind most of the arguments that I gave you earlier. So causal redundancy arguments that I started with rely on the Eleatic principle that we should only accept those entities that make a causal difference, right? And I motivated this for you by suggesting, look, it's a reasonable principle if you're a physicist and you're trying to decide whether you should accept the existence of neutrons as well as protons and electrons. You want to know what extra causal difference it makes, what else we can account for, right? Seems reasonable there. But it's not so obvious that this kind of principle carries over to deciding whether or not we should accept both tables, as is often put, and the fundamental particles they're composed of. There may be a different kind of relationship going on here. We can talk more about that in the discussion if you want. It's clearly not obvious that we have to appeal to extra causal work to account for the table as well as the fundamental particles that compose it for this metaphysical question. Parsimony arguments that given that the table's not doing any extra work for us, we better eliminate it on grounds of parsimony, of course rely on the idea that metaphysics is engaged in a process of theory formation guided by the theoretical virtues like parsimony, simplicity, and explanatory power. If you think instead of metaphysics as just trying to answer these descriptive questions, hey, what exists, not as trying to construct a theory that's going to maximize the theoretic virtues, it's not clear that parsimony is going to play a central role for you. It's also really at work, I think, in the sort of uses to which the special composition question are put. So the pressure that's put on those who believe in the existence of ordinary objects by the wielder of the special composition question is usually this. Look, we need some uniform theory that's going to explain why composition occurs in some cases rather than others. And none of these theories is going to give you ordinary objects. So Terry Horgan, who I gather was my predecessor here, maybe some of you saw him when he came last month, writes, for example, on this score, that an adequate metaphysical theory, like an adequate scientific theory, should be systematic and general, and should keep to a minimum the unexplained facts that it posits. Even though explanation presumably must bottom out somewhere, it should bottom out with the kinds of unexplained explainers we expect to find in physics, viz. Highly general, highly systematic, theoretical laws. So you see again the assumption that what we're doing here is to be done on this, according to the same principles as scientific theory construction, right? And it's that puts the pressure on to find a uniform explanation of why composition happens in some cases and not others, as if we were looking for an explanation of why some things dissolve in water and others don't, right? For why oil doesn't dissolve in water but sugar does. You can see the scientific assumption similarly at work in the grounding problem, right? The grounding problem raises this sort of puzzle for you. How could it possibly be that the table and the collection of particles differ in their modal and historical properties, given that they've got all the same parts, given that they're in the same place at the same time, they have all the same causal powers? What could explain that? Again, what they're doing is demanding a kind of bottom-up quasi-scientific explanation of the apparent differences in the modal, historical, and sort of kind properties of the table versus the collection of properties, as we might demand an explanation for the difference between how a piece of copper behaves in a flame and how a piece of wood behaves in flame. Right? Now, all of this might seem this sort of scientistic assumption might seem fairly obvious or even inevitable to those who were brought up on recent mainstream metaphysics. But it's not completely inevitable, and it hasn't been historically the only option. What's the alternative? Rewind the clocks back a bit. The problem that really had philosophers obsessed, at least since the middle of the 1800s, and that was sort of behind the life's work of people like Husserl, people like Ryle, certainly a question worried about by Mill, Eyre, and Carnap, Wittgenstein, is given the success of the natural sciences, what role is left for philosophy? What's left for us to do? And what are the proper methods of philosophy? Now, the sciences had peeled off one by one, psychology last, right at the early part of the 20th century. They've become self-conscious about their own methodology. What's left for philosophy? What are we to do? And the standard answer given by all these otherwise fairly diverse philosophers, right, whose names I've got up there, was along these lines. Look, philosophy is fundamentally concerned with meanings, not with matters of fact. And they took the role of philosophy then to be complementary to that of the experimental sciences, that philosophy was to help us get clear about the meanings of our terms, to engage in conceptual analysis, or to distinguish sense from nonsense, to avoid entering into nonsense, to getting rid of nonsensical questions. So they differed, of course, among themselves a lot in their understandings of what meanings are, of how we are to study them in philosophy, and so on. But still, they were all on the same side of the street of having this conception of philosophy as separate from science, as concerned in some sense with analyzing meanings rather than fact, or with distinguishing sense from nonsense, not with theory construction or engaging in deep discoveries about how the world really is. Now, if you approach philosophy, or at least metaphysics, on roughly this model, ordinary objects don't come into question, right? That is their existence. You don't question their existence. Why not? Well, the first reason is on this model, philosophy is not properly concerned with factual matters of existence at all. Instead, it's concerned with matters of meaning, not matters of fact, right? But beyond that, if you did ask, do tables really exist, right, at that stage, then if you analyze the meaning of an ordinary term like table, seems fairly obvious that in a situation in which you've got particles arranged table-wise, as Van Inwagen will put it, yep, that's a condition that is good enough to make it true that there are tables, right, in which table applies. So it looks just obvious that the conditions are fulfilled. We have a sort of descriptive approach to these existence questions, not a theory construction enterprise. Now, this whole approach to philosophy was rejected famously by Quine, right? Quine rejected the linguistic or conceptual approach to philosophy or to metaphysics on grounds of denying that questions of meaning or questions of language choice are distinct from questions of fact. He thought these all came together as part of a total theoretic enterprise, and they can't be separated. So there's no hope of doing a kind of meaning analysis that's separate from the factual theoretical enterprise that's engaged in by the natural sciences. And so on Quine's view, then, we see philosophy as not being separate from science, but as just engaged in the same total theoretic enterprise. So it's in Quine's wake, really, that all these kinds of arguments against ordinary objects, or at least most of them, have become possible, have become plausible, since they all seem to rely on this conception of philosophy as engaged in a kind of theory construction and as subject to the constraints of the theoretic virtues and so on. And so this is why debates about the existence of ordinary objects have really quickly turned meta-metaphysical. So you start arguing about chairs and you end up arguing about metaphysics and what we're doing here. At least that's what happened to me, right? And not just me. So you look at the arguments against ordinary objects based on the Eleatic principle, that we should only accept those objects that have distinct causal powers, and then you might start to bring into question whether this principle that is perfectly reasonable for scientific theory construction or maybe for detective work, right, whether this principle is really relevant to addressing whether tables as well as collections of particles exist. You look at the special composition question, and you begin to wonder whether it really is appropriate to demand a unified kind of explanatory answer of why composition occurs in some cases rather than others, as you might try to ask the question of why combustion occurs in some cases rather than others. You might address whether or not parsimony is a relevant criterion for deciding among competing ontologies, if we're not thinking of ontologies as sort of total theories constrained by scientific virtues, but just as asking simple descriptive questions about what exists. Now, there are other issues that still remain that aren't directly addressed by this sort of scientific conception. The kind of argument that suggests that there's an inconsistency in the very concept of our table, right, the Sorites form argument that Unger raised, that doesn't obviously rely on anything like a sort of scientific conception of metaphysics. But still, there are some interesting meta-metaphysical issues that arise for this. We get a claim, say from Unger, that there's an inconsistency in our ordinary concept of table. When should we be ready to give credit to claims to find an inconsistency in our ordinary concepts? G.E. Moore, for example, that's him up there, sort of famously suggested that we have more reason to believe the common sense view that there are tables and chairs than we do to believe that any philosophical argument to the contrary didn't go wrong somewhere, isn't fallacious somehow. And so no philosophical argument can shake us out of this belief, even an alleged inconsistency. So we might want to suspect that any alleged inconsistency is not a real inconsistency. There's a way around it, that it's just an apparent inconsistency, that somehow the concept is being misrepresented. Even if an inconsistency is found, right, there's the question of what should we do? Should we simply declare that tables don't exist if there's an inconsistency, or should we find a way to sort of minimally revise the concept while preserving the view that tables exist? I mentioned this morning at my talk that there has actually been a clear demonstration by a philosopher, Ted Cohen, that the rules of baseball are inconsistent. Right? He has a paper called "There Are No Ties at First," and he lays it all out. He showed it to the baseball commissioners. But if it turns out the rules of baseball are inconsistent, the natural move isn't to say, so there are no base hits, there are no runs, there are no hits or errors or whatever. Instead, the natural move is to say, look, something went wrong with this personification of the sort of informal rules people were playing according to. Let's revise it a little. The basic metaphysical problems that are raised against accepting ordinary objects, problems like vagueness and collocation, right? Again, there are questions to be raised about whether these problems really are sort of fundamental metaphysical problems, or if they're just pseudo-problems based in sort of misleading ways of speaking. And some of the sort of responses to these have suggested that they're not really deep problems, they're only verbal problems. Similarly, for vagueness, right, there's the question of whether the vagueness that we purport to find in the ordinary objects really is, in some sense, a robust metaphysical vagueness in the world that we have to worry about. How could there be these fuzzy objects in the world? Or is it, in some sense, traceable to features of our own conceptual scheme or language? And so what Mark Sainsbury calls an anodyne form of vagueness. Or do we need this robust metaphysical sense of vagueness? And if we do, is there a problem with that? All right, collocation I mentioned a moment ago. Do we need a deep metaphysical explanation of the possibility of two objects being in the same place at the same time? Or is it just a product, the appearance of a problem, just a product of problematic turns of phrase, category mistakes, or misuse of the term object, or of our counting practice when we say there's two objects in the same place at the same time? I can talk more about that later if anyone wants to. Even if these are genuine puzzles, right, another methodological background question arises. Well, should we use them as grounds for eliminating the objects? As Van Imwagen says, if there are no artifacts, there are no philosophical problems about artifacts. Good reason to get rid of the artifacts, right? Or should we take it as obvious that there are ordinary objects and try to solve the puzzles, right? As this is Lynn Baker, who tries to sort of provide a metaphysical solution, a robust solution to these problems with her constitution theory. Okay, so in short then, controversies over the existence of ordinary objects, you might think sound nuts at first glance. And maybe in a sense they are. But I think they're not without interest. Even if you think still, despite having heard me give a brief overview of the arguments against them, that it's just obvious that there are tables and chairs, right? Understanding what the arguments against them are and what they presuppose can help you understand what's going on in metaphysics, and maybe lead you to question some of the ways in which contemporary metaphysics is done. So these controversies over the existence of ordinary objects quickly drag us into these kinds of meta-metaphysical quandaries about what we're doing in metaphysics, about what the success criteria are. Are the criteria of theory, choice, and science relevant or not, for example? Are we doing a kind of meaning analysis or a kind of factual theory construction? And so I think then that this shows why issues about the existence of ordinary objects are interesting and important to contemporary philosophy. And they should be seen as that way, even if you think it is just obvious that there are, or for that matter, that there aren't, tables, chairs, or other ordinary objects. That's it.